Detroit Metropolitan Airport, November 1968. The terminal buzzed with the usual chaos of arrivals and departures, but Marvin Gaye stood perfectly still near Gate 12, watching passengers emerge from the long corridor. He had been waiting for 47 minutes, checking his watch every few seconds, smoking one cigarette after another until the ashtray beside him overflowed with nervous energy. When Frankie finally appeared, Marvin almost didn't recognize him. The boy who had left for Vietnam 18 months earlier, with bright eyes and patriotic fervor, was gone. In his place walked a stranger wearing Frankie's face, thinner, hollow-cheeked, with a thousand-yard stare that seemed to look through everything and everyone. Frankie's uniform hung loose on his diminished frame, and he carried his duffel bag like it contained stones rather than belongings. When their eyes met, there was no smile, no relief, no joy of reunion. Just recognition followed immediately by something that looked like shame. Marvin approached slowly, unsure whether to embrace his younger brother or give him space. "Welcome home, Frankie," he said quietly, reaching for the duffel bag. Frankie pulled back instinctively, clutching the bag tighter. "I got it," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the airport noise. They walked to the car in silence, Marvin stealing glances at his brother, trying to understand what had happened to the confident young man who had enlisted with such conviction. During the drive through Detroit streets, Marvin attempted conversation. "How was the flight? Are you hungry? Mom's making your favorite dinner." But Frankie's responses came in single words or nods, his eyes fixed on something beyond the windshield that only he could see. When they passed a construction site where workers were using pneumatic hammers, Frankie's entire body tensed, his hands gripping the door handle until his knuckles turned white. The sound of metal against concrete seemed to transport him somewhere else entirely. That night, Marvin sat in his childhood bedroom in the house on Gramercy Place, listening to muffled sounds coming from Frankie's room next door. Crying, which stopped abruptly whenever footsteps approached. Mumbled conversations with people who weren't there. And twice, loud crashes as furniture was knocked over, followed by apologetic whispers. Marvin wanted to go to his brother, to offer comfort, but every time he stood up to cross the hallway, something held him back. What could he say to someone who had seen things he couldn't imagine? The first few weeks of Frankie's return established a new rhythm in the Gaye household. During the day, Frankie would sit on the back porch for hours, smoking and staring at nothing. He startled at sudden noises, refused to sleep with the lights off, and couldn't tolerate crowded spaces. When relatives came to welcome him home, Frankie would retreat to his room, emerging only after they had gone. The family learned to speak in hushed tones around him, to avoid topics related to war or violence, to pretend not to notice when he woke up screaming in the middle of the night. Marvin watched his brother's daily struggle with a growing sense of helplessness. The confident young man who had looked up to him, who had been so proud to serve his country, was now unable to function in the world he had fought to protect. And the timing made everything worse. While Frankie was fighting in the jungles of Vietnam, Marvin had been recording love songs in comfortable studios, earning money and fame while his brother risked his life. The guilt was overwhelming. Why had Marvin been safe while Frankie suffered? What right did he have to success while his brother couldn't even sleep through the night? But Marvin's guilt was compounded by another tragedy unfolding simultaneously. Tammy Terrell, his duet partner and one of his closest friends, was dying slowly from brain cancer. Throughout 1968 and into 1969, Marvin watched Tammy deteriorate from the vibrant performer who had made their duets so magical into a frail shadow of herself, enduring surgery after surgery with diminishing hope. The juxtaposition was cruel. Frankie had survived Vietnam physically, but returned psychologically destroyed. Tammy was fighting a battle she couldn't win against an enemy growing inside her own body. Marvin found himself caught between two kinds of grief: the anticipatory mourning for Tammy, whose death seemed inevitable despite everyone's prayers and medical interventions, and the complicated mourning for Frankie, who had returned alive but was somehow lost to them anyway. Both situations left Marvin feeling powerless, unable to fix or heal or protect the people he loved most. The world suddenly seemed like a place where suffering was random and meaning was scarce. One evening in early 1969, Marvin and Frankie sat together on the porch, the silence between them heavy with unspoken understanding. Frankie had been home for several months, but they had never really talked about Vietnam, about what he had seen, what he had done, what had been done to him. Marvin was afraid to ask, and Frankie seemed unable to volunteer the information. But that night something shifted. "You know what the worst part was?" Frankie said suddenly, his voice cutting through the evening air. Marvin waited, afraid that any response might stop his brother from continuing. It wasn't the killing. It wasn't watching friends die. It was coming back and realizing that none of it mattered. All those boys dead, all that destruction. And for what? So politicians could save face. So weapons manufacturers could get rich. Frankie's words hung in the air, and Marvin felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of the world. His brother had volunteered to serve his country with genuine belief in the righteousness of the cause. He had been willing to die for America, for democracy, for freedom. But Vietnam had taught him that wars could be fought for reasons that had nothing to do with justice or protection, that young men could be sacrificed for political expediency, that the system they had been raised to trust could send them to die for lies. "I keep thinking about this kid from Memphis," Frankie continued, his voice growing quieter. "Tommy Henderson, 18 years old, joined up the same day as me. We were in the same unit, slept in bunks next to each other. He used to talk about his girlfriend back home, showed me her picture every day, had their wedding planned for when he got back." Frankie paused, lighting another cigarette with shaking hands. "Tommy stepped on a mine 3 months before his tour was supposed to end. Died instantly. And I keep thinking, for what? What did Tommy die for? What did any of us suffer for?" The conversation that night changed something in Marvin. His brother's questions became his questions. If Tommy Henderson could die for nothing in Vietnam, if Tammy Terrell could waste away from cancer at 24, if young black men could be sent to fight and die in foreign countries while facing oppression at home, then what was the point of singing love songs? What was the purpose of entertainment in a world falling apart? For months, Marvin had been struggling to write music that felt honest. Every time he sat at the piano to work on material for Motown, he found himself paralyzed by the disconnect between what he was expected to produce and what he actually felt. How could he sing about romantic love when his heart was breaking for his brother and his dying friend? How could he create escapist entertainment when real suffering demanded acknowledgement? But Frankie's words about Vietnam, about meaningless death and institutional betrayal, crystallized something for Marvin. The music industry, like the military, was a system that used people for purposes they didn't fully understand. Artists were sent into studios to produce content that served corporate interests, just as soldiers were sent into jungles to fight wars that served political interests. In both cases, the human cost was secondary to the profit motive. The realization was both liberating and terrifying. If Marvin was going to continue making music, it had to mean something. It had to address the realities that were tearing his world apart. It had to ask the questions that Frankie was asking, that Marvin was asking, that anyone paying attention should be asking. What's going on? Why is there so much suffering? How do we make sense of a world that seems designed to break people? But Motown Records had built its empire on a very different philosophy. Berry Gordy's formula was simple. Create polished, palatable music that could cross racial lines and generate maximum profit. Politics were dangerous. Controversy was bad for business. Artists were supposed to entertain, not educate or agitate. The Motown sound was specifically designed to be safe, romantic, optimistic. It sold the dream of love conquering all, of music as pure escapism. When Marvin approached Berry Gordy with his ideas for politically conscious music, the response was immediate and unequivocal. No, absolutely not. Motown artists don't make protest songs. They make hits. The meeting in Berry's office was tense and frustrating. Marvin tried to explain what he was feeling, what he needed to express. But Berry saw only commercial suicide. "You want to throw away everything we've built?" Berry asked, leaning back in his leather chair. "You think people want to hear about war and death and suffering when they turn on the radio? They want to dance, Marvin. They want to fall in love. They want to forget their problems, not be reminded of them." Marvin understood Berry's perspective. From a business standpoint, it made perfect sense. But from a human standpoint, it felt like betrayal. How could he continue to pretend that love songs mattered when his brother was broken by war and his friend was dying of cancer? How could he manufacture happiness when everything around him was falling apart? The conflict between artistic integrity and commercial expectations created a deadlock that lasted for months. Marvin stopped recording. He avoided the studio. He spent his time visiting Tammy in the hospital, talking with Frankie about Vietnam, and wrestling with questions that had no easy answers. Berry grew increasingly frustrated with his star performer's unwillingness to work, but Marvin couldn't force himself to create music that felt dishonest. Meanwhile, the world outside continued to spiral into chaos. The civil rights movement was fragmenting under pressure and violence. Martin Luther King Jr. had been assassinated in April 1968, shattering dreams of peaceful change. Cities burned in riots that expressed decades of suppressed rage. The Vietnam War dragged on, consuming lives and resources with no clear purpose or end in sight. Young people were protesting in the streets, questioning authority, demanding answers that their leaders couldn't or wouldn't provide. In March 1970, when Tammy Terrell finally succumbed to brain cancer, Marvin's grief reached a breaking point. The funeral was devastating, a culmination of 3 years of watching someone he cared about fade away inch by inch. Standing beside her casket, Marvin felt the full weight of everything he had been carrying. Frankie's trauma, Tammy's death, the meaninglessness of war, the emptiness of commercial music. It all crashed down on him at once. But in the depths of that grief, something crystallized. Tammy's death wasn't just a personal loss. It was a symbol of all the senseless suffering in the world. If her life had meaning, if Frankie's pain had purpose, if Tommy Henderson's death had significance, it was only if their experiences could somehow contribute to greater understanding, to positive change, to questions that needed to be asked. Marvin went home from the funeral and sat at his piano. For the first time in months, music came naturally. Not the polished, commercial sound that Motown expected, but something raw and honest and necessary. The melody was simple, almost conversational. The lyrics were questions rather than answers. What's going on? What's happening? Can someone tell me what's happening? The song poured out of him in a single session, years of suppressed emotion and delayed creativity finally finding expression. When he played it back, Marvin knew it was different from anything he had ever recorded. It wasn't a love song or a dance track or anything that fit Motown's established categories. It was a prayer, a plea, a demand for truth in a world full of lies. But when Marvin presented the song to Berry Gordy, the reaction was exactly what he had expected and feared. Too political, too risky, too different from the Motown sound. Berry refused to release it, just as he had refused to consider any of Marvin's previous attempts at socially conscious music. The pattern was familiar and infuriating. This time, however, Marvin was ready for the fight. Months of grief and frustration had given him clarity about what mattered and what didn't. His relationship with Motown, his commercial success, even his financial security were secondary to his need to create music that reflected reality. If Berry wouldn't release What's Going On, then Marvin would find someone who would, or he would leave Motown altogether. The ultimatum was simple and non-negotiable. Release the song or lose the artist. For Berry, it was an impossible choice. Marvin was one of Motown's biggest stars, a consistent hitmaker whose departure would cost the label millions. But releasing politically charged music could alienate mainstream audiences, radio programmers, and distributors who preferred entertainment to enlightenment. The standoff lasted for weeks. Marvin refused to record anything else until What's Going On was released. Berry continued to argue for commercial considerations over artistic expression. Meanwhile, other Motown artists and producers watched the conflict with interest and concern, understanding that the outcome would set precedents for everyone working at the label. Finally, pressure from various sources convinced Berry to compromise. He agreed to release What's Going On as a single, but only as a test. If it failed commercially, Marvin would return to making conventional music. If it succeeded, they could discuss additional politically conscious material. It wasn't the full artistic freedom Marvin wanted, but it was permission to try something different. The song was released in May 1971, and the response was immediate and overwhelming. Radio stations that typically avoided political content found themselves unable to resist the combination of beautiful melody and urgent message. Audiences embraced both the music and the questions it raised. Critics praised Marvin's artistic evolution and social consciousness. What's Going On became not just a hit, but a cultural phenomenon. But for Marvin, the success of the song was bittersweet. He had proven that music could address serious subjects without sacrificing commercial appeal. He had opened doors for other artists to explore political themes. He had created something that honored Tammy's memory and acknowledged Frankie's suffering. Yet none of that brought Tammy back or healed his brother's psychological wounds. Frankie continued to struggle with what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. The nightmares persisted. The startled reactions to sudden noises continued. The sense of meaninglessness and betrayal remained. Marvin's musical success couldn't undo the damage that Vietnam had inflicted on his brother's psyche. Success felt hollow when it couldn't solve the problems that had inspired it. Years later, when What's Going On was recognized as one of the greatest albums of all time, when its influence on soul music and social consciousness was undeniable, Marvin reflected on the price of that achievement. He had sacrificed his relationship with Berry Gordy, who never fully forgave him for forcing political content onto Motown. He had risked his career and financial security. He had opened himself to criticism and controversy, but the real cost was more personal and permanent. Marvin had learned that artistic expression, no matter how powerful or successful, couldn't heal the wounds that inspired it. He could sing about war's devastation, but he couldn't undo Frankie's trauma. He could honor Tammy's memory in song, but he couldn't bring her back. He could ask urgent questions about social justice, but he couldn't single-handedly change systems of oppression. The success of What's Going On created expectations that Marvin would continue to be music's social conscience, a role that felt both necessary and impossible. How could one person carry the weight of all the world's problems? How could any artist be responsible for addressing every injustice, every tragedy, every unanswered question? Frankie, meanwhile, remained largely invisible to the public that celebrated Marvin's political awakening. His brother's trauma had inspired one of the most important albums in music history, but Frankie himself continued to battle demons that success couldn't touch. The irony was painful. Marvin had become famous for asking, "What's going on?" But he still couldn't answer that question for the person whose suffering had prompted it. The relationship between the brothers deepened after the album's success, bonded by shared understanding of loss and disillusionment. But it also became more complicated. Marvin's ability to transform pain into art, to find meaning and recognition in suffering, created a gap between them. Frankie had experienced trauma, but couldn't express it creatively. His wound remained raw and unprocessed, while Marvin's had been transformed into something beautiful and valuable. In quiet moments, usually late at night when sleep wouldn't come, Marvin would sit with Frankie and talk about the weight of survival. Both had lived through experiences that killed others. Tammy had died. Tommy Henderson had died. Countless soldiers and civilians in Vietnam had died. But they were still breathing, still trying to make sense of existence in a world that seemed designed to break people. "Sometimes I think about Tommy," Frankie would say, staring out at the Detroit skyline. "Wonder what kind of music he would have liked. Wonder what he would have thought about your album. Wonder if any of it would have mattered to him." And Marvin would have no answer, because the questions his brother asked were the same ones that haunted him. Success was meaningful only if it served something larger than itself. Art was valuable only if it contributed to understanding, healing, progress. But how could anyone measure that impact? How could anyone know if their work actually made the world better? The legacy of What's Going On grew over the decades that followed. Other artists cited it as inspiration for their own political music. Scholars analyzed its influence on soul, funk, and hip-hop. Social justice movements adopted its anthems as rallying cries. The album became proof that popular music could address serious subjects without sacrificing artistic or commercial success. But for Frankie Gaye, the album remained what it had always been: his big brother's attempt to make sense of senseless suffering. The fact that millions of people connected with that attempt was gratifying, but it didn't change the fundamental reality of trauma, loss, and the search for meaning in an often meaningless world. When Marvin was killed by his father in 1984, one day before his 45th birthday, Frankie was left with complicated grief. His brother had died violently, just as so many soldiers in Vietnam had died violently, just as Tammy had died slowly but inevitably. The irony was bitter. Marvin had transformed his brother's war trauma into music that asked urgent questions about violence and injustice, only to become a victim of violence himself. At Marvin's funeral, Frankie sat quietly in the front row, listening to tributes that praised his brother's artistic courage and social consciousness. People spoke about What's Going On as a masterpiece of protest music, a landmark achievement in American culture. But Frankie remembered the night when Marvin first played the song, raw and unpolished, a cry of pain disguised as a work of art. The questions that had started in a conversation between brothers on a Detroit porch had evolved into an album that changed music history. But the answers remained as elusive as they had been in 1968, when a young soldier returned from Vietnam broken and a young artist struggled to understand why the world was falling apart. Today, when people listen to What's Going On, they hear brilliance, innovation, and timeless social commentary. They hear questions that remain relevant, pain that transcends specific historical moments, hope that persists despite overwhelming evidence of human cruelty and institutional failure. But they don't hear Frankie Gaye's nightmares, or Tammy Terrell's final breath, or the specific conversations that transform personal trauma into universal art. Perhaps that's as it should be. Music's power lies partly in its ability to transcend the specific circumstances of its creation, to speak to experiences and emotions that extend far beyond any individual story. What's Going On belongs now to everyone who has ever wondered why suffering exists, why systems fail, why love isn't enough to heal the world's wounds. But for those who knew Marvin personally, who understood the cost of that artistic transformation, the album remains what it was from the beginning. One man's attempt to make sense of his brother's pain, his friend's death, and his own responsibility as an artist in a world that desperately needed both beauty and truth. The questions Marvin asked in 1971 echo still, unanswered, and perhaps unanswerable. What's going on? What's happening? Can someone tell me what's happening? The music provides no solutions, offers no certainties, promises no easy comfort. It simply acknowledges that the questions exist, that they matter, that asking them is sometimes the most honest thing an artist can do. And in that acknowledgement lies both the triumph and the tragedy of What's Going On. It succeeded in ways its creator never imagined, influencing generations of musicians and activists, proving that popular art could address serious subjects without sacrificing integrity or appeal. But it failed to heal the wounds that inspired it, failed to answer the questions it posed, failed to prevent the violence that would eventually claim its creator. Frankie Gaye lived the rest of his life carrying both the pride of having inspired a masterpiece and the sadness of understanding that masterpieces, no matter how powerful or enduring, cannot undo the damage that creates them. His brother's music had given meaning to his suffering, but it had not eliminated that suffering. And perhaps that's the most honest thing art can do. Acknowledge pain without promising to heal it. Ask questions without claiming to answer them. Transform experience into something beautiful without pretending that beauty can solve everything. The conversation on that Detroit porch in 1969 had started with a soldier's question about meaningless death and institutional betrayal. It had evolved into an album that questioned war, poverty, environmental destruction, and spiritual crisis. But at its core, it remained what it had always been. One brother trying to understand another's pain, and in that understanding, finding both the inspiration and the responsibility to create something larger than himself.